a dogma lesson, just not bothering to plan? That's a question for TEFLologists. When I read this book, is it better to skim or scan? That's a question for TEFLologists. Can you be a good teacher if you have a CELTA? Or should you invest in an MA or a Delta? From politics to methodology, we'll discuss them all on TEFLology.
Welcome to another interview episode of TEFLology. Recently, Matt and Rob attended the 4th Waseda ELF International Workshop here in Tokyo. As many of you know, ELF stands for English as a Lingua Franca. They were lucky enough to talk to two of the presenters, Dr. Henry Widdowson and Dr. Barbara Seidlhofer. Professor Henry Widdowson is an internationally acclaimed authority in applied linguistics and language teaching. His many books, articles, and lectures are seminal in the field of applied linguistics, and his books, Teaching Languages Communication and Defining Issues in Language Teaching, have helped to form how modern language teachers operate today. Professor Barbara Seidlhofer is the editor of Controversies in Applied Linguistics, co-editor of Principle and Practice in Applied Linguistics, and author of Understanding English as a Lingua Franca. Professor Seidlhofer is involved with the linguistic description of English as a lingua franca and works on the voice corpus of spoken interactions between non-native speakers, language variation and change, and language policy in a multicultural setting. Both professors currently hold positions at the University of Vienna in Austria. At the ELF workshop, Dr. Widdowson gave a talk titled The Pragmatics of ELF Variation, and Dr. Seidlhofer gave a talk titled The Global Significance of ELF Study. Matt and Rob attended both talks and afterwards spoke to Dr. Widdowson and Dr. Seidlhofer about some of their ideas.
Well, thank you for joining us for the interview. So perhaps we'll start with the idea of what English as a lingua franca is. So some people have an idea that it's a fixed variety, and some people have an idea that it's more of a set of communication strategies. What definition would you use?
Mm-hmm. Well, certainly not the fixed variety. Okay. As Henry was saying yesterday, it's really all about the pragmatics of variation. I'm sure you will talk more about this. Basically, it's very simple. It's defined by or arises from the situation, from the communication situation. So wherever you need English as a means of communication among people from different linguocultural backgrounds, then you are using English as a lingua franca. So that's what we're doing at the moment, right? Okay. Yes. I think it's very misleading to try and fix it in varieties, because that's exactly not what is so interesting about ELF research. Right. I'll keep it short now so that maybe you would like to...
It's essentially an appropriate use of the resources of English for a whole range of purposes, globalized purposes, ranging from business transactions to international diplomacy, conflict resolution, and so on. All of these depend on some common means of communication, and very often the only one available is English. But it's unrealistic to think it's the English which is, as it were, simply replicated from native speaker norms. It's an English which is adaptable to these different situations.
Okay. And it's not only in these high stakes or important formal occasions, but especially also in the voice corpus we have leisure data, so yes. It's just people meeting socially, right. Over a drink or something, and chatting, and
yes, and it could be. I mean, the extent to which the resources of English are drawn upon, and the extent to which this conforms to native speaker norms, will depend on the purpose of the interaction and who is involved in it. So it's a matter of what is an appropriate form of communication to use for in this context for these purposes. Sometimes it'll be very similar, if not, it'll be standard English, because that's the appropriate language.
Right. Well, I think that leads us quite nicely into the next question, actually.
Yeah, so in your talk yesterday, you mentioned that ELF interactions could perhaps be seen to flout certain maxims.
Yes.
Related to pragmatics.
Yes.
Could you give some examples of flouting these maxims?
I'm not sure I can give a particular example off the top of my head, but the point I was making is that these maxims that Grice proposes are very much dependent on a knowledge of the genre concerned, of the purpose and direction of the talk. And if you are not aware of this, then you may come up with an expression which in a conventional native speaker context would be heard as you intending to be ironical, for example, by saying more than by flouting the maxim of the truth maxim, you're saying something which is palpably untrue, but you recognize as saying it because you want to create an effect. So long as you understand that in those circumstances this is something which can be interpreted in this way, fine. But if you don't, you're not familiar with these conventions, how do you know that this is an exaggeration intended to be amusing? Or how do you know that this is not actually what you mean to say? So again, if you produce what sounds like an innovative turn of phrase, if you're in a native speaker context, you assume the other will recognize this as innovative. You're trying to create an effect by using it. But it may not be the purpose at all, or the intention, if you don't know this convention. That's essentially the point.
You mentioned just now about high-stakes situations, and yesterday in your talk, Dr. Seidlhofer, you said that ELF is very important for dealing with high-stakes situations. Could you explain that a little bit?
Well, I just thought of the research that had been done so far, and it struck me that generally this has been sort of not the kind of gatekeeping encounters that have a lot to do with how we live our lives and what we find easy to do and difficult to do. I mean, we're all up against some gatekeeping, and a lot of that goes on the international scene via English as a lingua franca. And it just struck me that some of the very important and very topical and also notorious things that happen in the world happen via English as a lingua franca. So I thought it was just interesting to remind ourselves as self-researchers that it's not all about, just being friends together by speaking English, but that there are very difficult encounters that happen via ELF. And one example was asylum seeking. The processes that happen. So either by asylum seekers arriving, say, on the shores of Europe, say southern Italy, and then say they are from Africa, for instance, Nigeria, they speak their own English of what Braj Kachel calls the outer circle, so their own variety. In this sense, it's really a variety of English, so it's their own English that they take for granted, and they meet the Italian officials and border officials, and they are interviewed. And these Italians have learned English as a foreign language and have a very different expectation as to what it means to speak good English. And there's a clash there that happens via English as a lingua franca. They're using English as a lingua franca, but it's not an easy situation. Also high stakes, of course, in this case particularly, because a lot depends on the success of this procedure, whether people get access to the country or are deported. So it can be, anything up to a matter of life and death. And all this happens via English as a lingua franca.
Okay, thanks. That's some nice examples.
And perhaps changing the topic slightly, talking more about the classroom. EFL points generally towards a learner-centered approach in teaching, kind of a collaborative effort between learners. Could you explain why this is more of a learner-centered approach and doesn't come from the teacher, essentially? If I've got that correct.
Basically, what counts as learning is what has been taken from the teaching, so to speak. So, what learners actually learn in the classroom is not actually valued unless it conforms to what has been taught. So everything depends upon conformity to the norms that the teacher has prescribed, the textbook and the curriculum and testers have prescribed. But the point is that the learner is not learning in accordance to what is being taught. I mean, they are, it's obvious from so-called errors, they are producing language which is derived in some way from the input, but clearly doesn't repeat it. And so why not? Yeah. One has to ask, why is this the case? Why do these errors occur? And my point would be that they are bringing to the learning of a second language all their experience of the first language, their own language. They know how their own language works. They know how they communicate in their own language. And instinctively, I think that they process the second language in terms of their first language understanding. Right? So they relate it to their own experience, which is what one would expect of learning. I mean, learning means relating what is new to what is familiar. But that relationship is denied in conventional English language teaching because learners are told not to refer to their own experience, so keep the mother tongue out of the classroom. Right. So the learner is learning bilingually, always. I mean, the other language is always there. As it is with ELF. I mean, with ELF usage, these are people who are bringing their own language to bear in the interaction as well. So they're using English, but it's English informed by their own experience of their own language. So what the ELF users do is also what the learners do. I mean, they're trying, except that the ELF learners are generally not penalised by failing their exams, whereas the learners are. So I think that to understand the nature of communication enacted through ELF is to understand what learners are striving to do, but their strivings are not rewarded, they're suppressed in the interest of conformity. So a learner-centered approach would recognise, to first understand what it is the learners are doing when they produce the language they do, and then make your teaching relate to that, rather than saying teaching comes first, you make the learners conform to the teaching.
Which is why you had this nice distinction between learners and teachees, and I really like that. You know, the teachees are the passive recipients.
If you've got an employee, you've got an employee. So you've got a teacher, you've got a teachee who works in accordance to what the demands of the teacher are. But my argument would be no, learners have their own identity, aspirations, experiences, and that's where you start.
And their own agency.
And their own agency.
Exactly. Agent.
That's right. That's right.
Okay, excellent. So maybe we'll have to wrap up with one more question. So just quickly, could you tell us a little about where you're interested in taking ELF research in the future, both of you?
Well, one of the things is actually what we started off with, is high-stakes encounters. I think we need to look more at these important interactions because we're all aware that they're happening, but we haven't really connected them so much to ELF research. Of course, there's been the tendency first to look at what kind of English is being taught now as in ELT, and how the research on English as a lingua franca can shed new light on that, because after all, that is the English that is used most across the globe. If you look at, certainly by all this, if you look at speaker numbers, or just interactions, actually, an awful lot goes on via English as a lingua franca. So that would be the one thing from a kind of applied linguistic view. More inside linguistics, as we have been talking about it here in the seminar, the processes, the underlying processes of communication are so interesting, and I think what helps us see what goes on in communication is exactly what we find in ELF, that we kind of look at interactions with a new set of eyes, if you like, and notice things that we are so familiar with other kinds of linguistic study, that we now understand process of communication better, and I think that can enlighten our study of communication, but particularly we should look at linguistics by bearing in mind these insights into communication. That was not expressed very clearly, but I'm sure Henry...
No, it's a matter of what the ELF phenomenon does. I mean, the globalization of the language does, is to make us aware, Barbara says, of processes of communication which beyond those associated with particular languages. Right? So it calls into question what should we think into the particular languages and how meaningful is that? Right. We know people know about the global community and so on and so forth. So the notion of a community is a fairly close-knit, sort of face-to-face networking, interactive kind of construct has already been questioned. And if you question the concept of community, you have to question the concept of language. And you have to question, therefore, the categories that linguists and sociolinguists have used for a long time. That's not to say you reject them completely, but you realize that living in the world, in other aspects of human life, have had to modify and change and think again. So globalization and English is lingua franca, which goes along with it, causes to rethink cherished categories and beliefs, and I think that can only be a healthy thing to do.
Okay. Well, thank you very much both for your time.
Nice.
Very interesting talk. Thank you very much.
Okay, nice to talk to you.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening, and we hope you enjoyed the interviews. We'll be back next time with a regular episode. As usual, we would love to hear from you. If you have any questions or comments, please email us. Email address is teflology@gmail.com. And of course, please follow us on Twitter. We are @teflology. So thank you and goodbye.